And yeah, so we'll start. That I think becomes a bit clearer when there is a broader historical context. So this is from Isaiah. When Ahaz, son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. Now the house of David was told, Aram has, um, pardon, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim, so the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Sorry, there seems to be a slight delay in thing. Okay. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out, you and your son Shear-Jashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool, on the road to the launderer's field. Say to him, be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of those two smoldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram, and of the son of Remaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin, saying, let us invade Judah, let us tear it apart, and divide it among ourselves, and make the son of Tabeel king over it. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says. It will not take place, it will not happen, for the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. So if you are just looking at this passage, just from the immediate sort of just if you were looking at this with no knowledge of it, you'd be asking, who are the people who are mentioned this? Who are, or, where are these countries that are being talked about here? Why do these things matter to us today? So, and of course, what happens next? Now, the Bible actually goes and gives us a lot of context of these. So you don't actually need to go and study history to get a lot of knowledge from the Old Testament. But I do think that perhaps a little bit of knowledge of the history might give a little bit of context that can go and help us on this. Yeah, Christina, sorry, you were wanting to say something? Okay. Yeah, history is complicated. So just before we kind of delve into it, let's go and have a quick look at what history is and what it is not. So think of something like World War II. World War II it's something that we would know pretty well. And if someone asked you off the top of your head, why did World War II start? You might sort of say, well, because Hitler started it. And this would be correct, broadly speaking. But if someone then sort of went and started talking about, well, what about the Treaty of Versailles or the Munich Agreement and so on and so forth, you would realize pretty quickly that there's a lot of other complex factors that feature into history. So history is the story of humanity, and humanity is complex. So the story of humanity is also going to be complex. So we just have to remember that when we're looking at history. Think of history kind of like Google Maps. You can look at, you start out with a broad picture of the world, and then as you zoom in, the picture changes. And it's not that the broad picture is wrong, the broad picture is entirely correct, but zooming in will give you greater detail, and this will kind of help you in looking at things. History, by and large, doesn't prove or disprove. So when you're dealing with history, particularly biblical history, you'll have people trying to prove the Bible or disprove the Bible, like hardcore atheists and stuff. And honestly, this type of thing, history is kind of too blunt an instrument to really do this. So think of the sheer amount of statements that are in the Bible, and think of what it would take to actually mathematically prove these in sort of like the modern sense. Like even with camera phones and so on and so forth, you would struggle to go and to get that level of documentary evidence to prove the entire Bible. Equally, to go and to disprove something in the Bible, you would have to go and have 100% knowledge of the artifact or the historical document that you're talking about. And you would also have to basically have 100% knowledge of that portion of the Bible that you were trying to prove or disprove. So basically, honestly, whenever you hear someone talking about it in these sort of very broad, simple terms, it generally gives the people who talk like this tend to have a shallow understanding of either history or the Bible or both. So just something to be aware of. So the next thing is history's a mess. So particularly ancient history. So imagine, yeah, we're quite used to thinking of history as quite a neat, well-ordered subject because history of more recent times tends to be quite well documented. But a better way to think of ancient history would be to imagine if, say, there was some great catastrophe and the entire Western civilization was wiped out, the whole global civilization that we're part of, just wiped off the face of the earth. And the only thing that survived was actually a rubbish dump outside of Carrick Cross. So think of the recycling centre out on the road. So imagine what would happen if archaeologists went and dug up that rubbish dump 3,000 years from now. They'd find a huge amount of information, but it would be very scattered. It would be a very messy set of information. It's possible that they might find the name of David Dancey, but not the name of Winston Churchill in this sort of thing. So we have to remember that the type of sources that we're having are going to be extremely messy. So history is selective. Now, this is actually one of my favorite pyramids. It's a broken pyramid, one that they made the calculations wrong on. It's in Egypt at a place called Maidum. And yeah, so history, when people write history in the ancient world, it tends to be kings or generals or high priests or important people talking about all the cool stuff that they've done. Now, one of the things that you don't do if you're trying to record all the good stuff you've done is record the bad stuff. So history tends to rely on sources that are basically propaganda. So something to be aware of when you go and you find a document from the ancient world, to try and figure out who's writing it, why they're writing it, what sort of stuff are they unlikely to record. So for example, this broken pyramid is a good example to show that people in the ancient world made mistakes as well, and they didn't really record them that much. So there are certain types of events that are very unlikely to show up in the historical record because just they're not the type of things that people would write about. So for example, there are no monuments, or sorry, there are no records of this broken pyramid. That is, the king who did it is kind of quiet about it. He went on to build another 2 pyramids, only one of which he messed up. So stuff like the Exodus is something that is just unlikely to be written about because no Egyptian pharaoh would have any interest in documenting what was quite an embarrassing failure. So just something to be aware of when dealing with sources from the ancient world. So now that we've talked about a little bit about history, let's have a quick dive in to actually look at the ancient world itself. And the ancient world was a smaller world. So historians estimate that the population of the world 3,500 years ago was probably closer to 100 million people. So our world has nearly 8 billion people alive today, which gives us kind of an 80-to-1 ratio of people alive now, people alive then. To put it another way, imagine in Carrick Baptist, it would be roughly the ratio of if everyone except Colin wasn't there. That's basically the ratio that we're looking at. So yeah, so we do have to remember the ancient world, there's a lot less people there. Next thing we have to remember is that it's a much tougher world. So this here is a medical papyrus. It's from Egypt from the 1700s, 1700s BC. And imagine living in a world where the best doctors on earth didn't know that the brain controlled thinking or that the heart pumped blood. So many women would just die in childbirth, and there was honestly nothing that could be done about it. If anyone contracted a serious illness, they were basically dead. The doctors were able to do very little apart from basic surgery. They tried, but they just weren't able to do much. In terms of safety, imagine a world where even if there are laws, and most societies do actually have laws, there are no police forces to go and enforce these laws. If a crime is not solved immediately, it is unsolved. So to leave your house, to leave your community is an extremely dangerous affair. Travelers in the ancient world have a really difficult time. If there are crop failures, you starve. If you grow old and you do not have children, you starve. If your parents die and you're a child and you're too young to work, you starve. We are used to living in a world where if something goes wrong, there are social safety nets, that there are things to stop us from getting into serious trouble. In the ancient world, if something goes wrong, it goes wrong very quickly and very badly indeed. So just something to be aware of. So based on that, so just use the phrase, the wisdom of Solomon. I think we need to have a better appreciation of the wisdom of our ancestors, because they not only existed in this world, they thrived in this world and were able to kind of make this world their own. And the fact that we have an easy life now is primarily because people who came before us made things easier for us, both through learning stuff and through building stuff. The largest constraint that they have, because when they do stupid things, it generally is because they're dealing with constraints that we don't have. The largest constraint that the ancient world has, far worse than their problems with medicine, is what I would term the energy problem. So, what is the energy problem? So, I've just put up a picture of the pyramids just to give an idea of a large project from the ancient world. So, if you want to do anything, particularly moving something, whether it's yourself, whether it's some food, whether it's blocks or anything, you need to go and use energy to do it. This is basic physics. To go and to do this, you need an energy source. Our civilization has lots of energy sources. We have nuclear, solar power, wind power, hydroelectric, etc., etc. The primary source of our civilization's energy actually comes from fossil fuels, from coal, from natural gas, particularly from oil. The ancient world doesn't really have any of this. The only energy, the primary energy source they have one or two. They can use a little bit of wind energy for sails and so on, but the primary energy source they have is muscle power, and nearly always human muscle power for a variety of reasons. So if you want to do something, you basically have to have people do it themselves. Which goes and puts, again, if you think of all the castles and cathedrals and temples and cities and everything that our ancestors did, if you remember that, yeah, they didn't really have industrial machinery to do this. They did most of this stuff by hand, which just gives an appreciation of kind of what all that these guys are able to do. So it means a large population is literally power. So how do you get the energy for the energy, so to speak? And the answer is agriculture. And agriculture is the single most important component of our civilization, and it was the same with the ancient world. They really struggled with agriculture, and we still struggle with it today. People at the periphery of our civilization will still face starvation. People face hunger, even in the Western world. But you cannot have civilization without agriculture. Hunter-gatherer societies aren't able to have the food surpluses to actually sustain cities. So without agriculture, you can't have large populations. Famine is never present threat in the ancient world. So to go and to support their populations, to keep their civilizations running, it's estimated that perhaps 90 to 95% of their population was involved directly in agriculture. So we think of like their kings and their priests and their warriors and so on. These are really only a tiny fraction of the people. The majority of them are farmers. And this actually holds true up until about maybe the 1800s, maybe about 200 years ago. Most societies in the world are predominantly agricultural. Our society is actually very unusual to not be agricultural. So yeah, just something to be to remember that agriculture is pivotal to the life of the peoples before the modern day. So there are two types of agriculture. The first one is rain-fed, and this is the type of agriculture that is practiced in ancient Israel, and it's not that different in principle from the agriculture that is practiced today in Ireland or to a certain extent in certain places in America. Rain-fed agriculture resembles our own agriculture. Each farmer has their own land. The land is inherited. It is passed on between generations. Rain falls and allows the soil to be fertile. The farmers go and plant the seeds. They harvest accordingly. If the rains do not come, they face drought and the land suffers. So rain is extremely important in rain-fed agriculture. Surprise, surprise. And yeah, so one of the things to remember with this is that land inheritance is extremely important, but that the boundaries are actually quite easy to maintain because you just need to put a marker there. The rains probably won't wash the marker away. You also don't need high levels of organization to do this. It doesn't really need much higher organization than, say, the village. So a farmer and his family, his extended family, and his neighbors are able to pretty much do all the work on the farm. They don't need to call in outsiders. They don't need a high level of organization. The thing that this does actually sort of highlight is the necessity of rain. You need rain to practice this type of agriculture. And without this type of agriculture, you starve. So they need rain to not starve. And pictured here is a statue of Baal from the Louvre. And this is a god statue of God thing that the Israelites will tend to worship throughout the Old Testament. And I think when I was reading the Old Testament as a kid, I was always kind of going, why did the Israelites continually try and worship Baal? I could never fully understand it. And I think the reason that they're so interested in worshiping Baal is that they're so afraid of drought that they are tempted when things are looking a little bit bad to go and to pray to another god. I think that's kind of the motivation behind it. So, I mean, obviously there are other sort of things possibly as well, but this is, to my mind, why I think the Israelites are so tempted by the type of idolatry that they are tempted by. The other type of the other type of thing that we're looking at is irrigation. So irrigation is, in this case, river-based irrigation. And yeah, so irrigation is, it's quite different from rain-fed. You do not rely on rain. Instead, you create canals and you channel water from the river through the canals and onto the fields. It's lifted onto the fields. This allows the land to be much more productive. In certain cases, you could get maybe 3 harvests for the price of 1, if that makes sense. However, this trade-off for the huge crop requires a trade-off in sort of organization. You need a lot more work. So see here, you can see it's an Egyptian sort of tomb painting showing a lot of people all working away at agricultural activities. Irrigation requires a complexity. It requires organizational complexity. You need someone to decide where to build the canals, who's going to work on what. You need someone to go and redraw the fields after their boundaries are destroyed by the floods. You need someone to go and count the grain, keep track of the grain. You need someone to redistribute the grain when everything has been gathered in. It basically, this type of agriculture kind of leads to people forming cities and leads to people forming kings and priestly hierarchies because the priests in these sort of civilizations tend to be involved in food distribution. It also involves the creation of scribal classes to keep track of all the amounts of barley and grain and so on. So we've covered quite a bit of ground here. I mean, this is a very, very broad picture of sort of life in the ancient world and some ideas and so on behind history. Does anyone have any questions just before we kind of move on?
Baal is the god of rain?
Yes, Baal is a title for a god by the name of Edad or Hadad from northern Syria. And yeah, so when the Old Testament talks about Baal, it's usually talking about that god, and that god is generally believed to be a rain god.
Thank you.
Anything else or any other questions? Okay, we'll move on. So now that we've had a look at sort of some broad sort of trends about the ancient world, let's have a look at the region, which is the Middle East. So this is a map of the Middle East. So we tend not to think of the Middle East as a particularly nice place, but historically, this is probably the most interesting place in the world. Before 1600 BC, there is not a single piece of readable writing on Earth outside of this picture, just to give an idea of just how important this place is for history. So just to have a quick look at the thing, sorry, one sec. Just gonna see if I can. Sorry, never mind. So yeah, this here you can see is the Mediterranean Sea. It's the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea. This is the Persian Gulf. This is the Red Sea. So down here, you can see in green against the desert, very obviously this is the Nile and the Nile Delta here. Here, less obvious than the Nile, you can see the River Euphrates coming down, coming into this green valley here. Along here, you can see the River Tigris. Again, less obvious than the Nile, but you can see where the Tigris and Euphrates draw close together. This green area here. Historically, this would have been much greener. This would have been a much more fertile land. There's a reason why it has become less fertile over the years. But this river plain would originally have been very green and fertile. These two areas here, the Nile Valley and the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, these are the two places where irrigation is practiced. In between them, and along this area here, is where rain-fed agriculture is practiced. So down here, you can see Israel, or the region, rough region where Israel was located. Damascus is around here. Further north, you have the places, the Neo-Hittite states in and around here. So that's roughly the region that we're looking at. So let's have a quick look at the river valleys. We'll start with Mesopotamia, which literally means in Greek, the land between the rivers. So this actually shows up quite early on in the Bible. So Terah took his son Abraham, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abraham, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So this is from Genesis chapter 11. So we'll have a quick look at the different regions of Mesopotamia. So the southernmost region is a place called Sumer. And Sumer is where it's where the sea meets the marshes, meets the river, meets the desert. It's a very flat land. There's nothing there except mud, and they use this mud to basically to build their cities, to grow their crops, to make their writing, etc. And Sumer, the last great city of Sumer is Ur, and it's the place where Abraham comes from. After Ur declines, Sumer kind of goes into decline. The land becomes less fertile. And as a result, it becomes kind of subsumed into Babylonia, which is to the north of it. So you don't, it's not necessarily all, Sumer doesn't show up much in the Bible, but it is there, and it's the birthplace of Abraham. So it's probably worth knowing a little bit about. So this is a very bad map, but it gives you some idea of the location of Sumer in this sort of dark red here, or pink, I'm not sure, I'm colorblind. Okay, so moving on to Babylonia, which is kind of the more central area of Mesopotamia. So this shows the Stargate of Babylon. And Babylonia, it was the central city of Babylonia is, of course, Babylon. There are other large cities there as well. But Babylon is the primary one that will be showing up throughout history. It is the cultural heartland of Mesopotamia for most of the history, but it's not always the militarily strongest place in Mesopotamia. So just something to keep an eye on. So this shows a map of Babylonia in and around 1200 BC under the rule of the Kassites. So this sort of dark region here is the Kingdom of Babylonia. Again, there are some problems with this map, but it does give a little better idea of the complexity of the canal systems that kind of move through the thing. So, moving on, we have Assyria. Now, Assyria is further to the north of Mesopotamia. It's where, topographically, it's where the mountains meet the river plains. So they don't rely entirely on irrigation. They also use rain-fed agriculture. And the Assyrians are, as I've tried to convey in this image, very militarily aggressive. So they might not be as ancient or as cultured as the Sumerians and Babylonians, but they tend to be a lot more militarily successful for much of their history. So just something to be aware of. So this dark red area here is the heartland of Assyria, although the map is in French. So just in case the names look a little bit unfamiliar there. So just to give some idea of Mesopotamian culture, as I was mentioning, they are very interested in irrigation. This is a map of an irrigation system from Babylon around 1600s BC. And they maintained these irrigation systems for thousands of years. They ultimately did break down, but while they lasted, they were astonishing. Very complex because the Tigris and the Euphrates are very unpredictable rivers, and there are two river systems that flood at slightly different times. So the canal systems that connected them had to be able to account for this. And yeah, they were able to go and sort of live in this very unpredictable land and actually thrive in it. They were also able to build stuff. As I was saying, there's really nothing in the plains of Mesopotamia. There's almost no wood, there's no natural resources, and there's no stone. Any stone or wood that they need, they realistically need to float down the rivers from the mountains in the north, or maybe import from across the sea. It's not easy to get stuff there. But here you can see that they've managed to build, this by the way is the city of Ur that Abraham comes from. So you can see palaces, temples, and this sort of artificial mountain type thing made out of mud brick with a temple at the top. And this is called a ziggurat. And it wouldn't be as large as the Egyptian pyramids because mud will fall down if you put too much weight on it. But considering that it's all entirely made out of river mud, it's actually quite impressive. So just something to sort of, if you're trying to imagine what these cities would have looked like, this is something like it. You can see that the areas outside the central complexes are not well planned, but that out here, you can see that there are very ordered and well-placed canals, all going out across this extremely flat plain. So I said that they used everything with mud. Like if you have nothing but mud, it's kind of inspirational how much they can do with it. This is cuneiform writing. This is the oldest writing system that we can read in the world. It is probably, almost certainly, the oldest writing system in the world, full stop. And it's done using about maybe 500 or so symbols, which are used. You take a piece of mud, you take a reed, and you press the reed into the clay to form wedge shapes. Cuneiform is a Latin word meaning wedge-shaped. So the languages that are used in this are Sumerian and Akkadian. Again, it's not really very relevant to know that, but just to be aware that the oldest writing in the world comes from this region here, which is now Iraq. They also developed a very impressive system of mathematics. So the reason I'm sort of talking about this type of stuff is to give an idea of just how advanced these guys were. Thousands of years ago, these guys were pretty advanced. They were missing some stuff that we have, but they had done a huge amount with very, very little. They had developed advanced mathematics. We still use some of their maths today. In fact, their geometry was so good that we actually still use the 360 degrees system that they developed for that. That's from their system of mathematics, not ours. And yeah, so they invented a lot of what we would now consider geometry. Their arithmetic was not nearly as good as ours, but their geometry was spot on. So they also were big into astronomy. So they had systems of writing, they had systems of mathematics, and they combined these with a priestly caste that watched the heavens to basically come up with astronomy. So theirs is the oldest record-based astronomy in the world. They also developed astrology, which is rather less impressive, but because their world was so unpredictable and so dangerous, they seem to have believed that the heavens, which were quite orderly except for the planets which moved in these sort of strange patterns, that these had somehow some bearing on events in Earth. So most of sort of the concepts of astrology actually come from this region. Turmoil. Mesopotamia was a very violent place. The reason is that it's extremely wealthy because it has so much food. It doesn't have anything else except food, but food is the most important thing to have, so they are wealthy. And because there are two river systems, it's quite difficult to control. People can just wander in from the mountains to the side, and because they have food, everyone is wandering in all the time. So because they have canals, it's very easy for one city to mess up another city's canals, so they fight over water control the whole time. Basically, Mesopotamian history is quite violent because of all the wars that they fight. It also means that they're quite good at fighting. So this is actually, it's in the Louvre, it is the oldest indication of military formations, and it comes from Sumer. So let's have a look at the other river civilization, which is Egypt, traditionally known as the Gift of the Nile. So I chose the crop of this picture rather badly. So this here Around the delta and a little bit south of the delta is what is known as Lower Egypt. Beneath this, further to the south, up the river, is Upper Egypt, so-called because it is up the river. And further to the south of this is the Kingdom of Khush. Over here is the western desert of Libya, and over here is the eastern desert of Sinai. So now there was famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. So this verse in Genesis gives us a brief picture of the fact that if something goes wrong with agriculture, unless you do something, in this case like Abraham moving, you run the risk of death. It also kind of shows that agriculture in Egypt was slightly less dependent on rain than places elsewhere. So it was kind of, if the rains failed in Israel, it was a good place to go to for food, because their agriculture was purely dependent on the Nile, not on rain. So Lower Egypt. So a lot of people are quite familiar with the pyramids. They would be outside the city of Memphis, and well, not immediately outside, but not that far away either. And yeah, so much of what the Israelites would have seen in Egypt would have been Lower Egypt, but not necessarily even as far south as Memphis. Most of the time when the Israelites are living in Egypt, like say, for example, when they live in Goshen, Goshen is at the very edge of the delta, so they wouldn't actually have gone that far south into Egypt. Upper Egypt. So during the late Bronze Age, the center of control in Egypt is actually in Upper Egypt, around the city of Thebes, which is depicted here. And much of what we think of, apart from the pyramids of Egypt, actually comes from Upper Egypt, from Thebes. So this gives a bit of a slightly better picture of Egypt during those days. So you see here Lower Egypt, centered around the city of Memphis, and then Upper Egypt, centered around the city of Thebes. And further to the south of this, past Abu Simbel, is Khush. Khush was not part of Egypt, but sometimes if Egypt was very strong, it would conquer Khush. If Egypt was very weak, Khush would try and return the favor. Khush it's very similar in culture to Egypt, but it's not quite the same. It's very similar, but not quite. They take a lot of Egyptian culture and actually preserve it for longer than the Egyptians do themselves. The Kushites build pyramids for longer than the Egyptians do. So even today, there are actually more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt, which is just, fun fact. Just in case you're looking for a holiday destination post-COVID, Sudan could be interesting. So Khush, there is a map of the Kingdom of Khush at its highest extent. I'm not overly happy with this map because realistically, they did control this area, but most of this area is desert outside of the Nile region. So but they did control a lot of the Nile. So their cities would have been Kerma, Napata, and Miro. Like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians also practiced irrigation, but their irrigation tended to be a lot simpler and a lot easier to kind of do. They only had one river to control, and their river was very reliable. The Nile floods with great regularity. It's a very stable river. So basically, they were able to, with a lot of backbreaking labor, but relatively simple canal systems, they were able to go and maintain a system of agriculture that lasted for, again, thousands of years. Architecture. So I said the Mesopotamians had no stone. The Egyptians have a lot of stone, and they build spectacularly with it. So I figured you were probably sick of seeing the Great Pyramid at this point. So here's another pyramid. This is the first pyramid that was ever built, the Pyramid of Djoser at Sakura. So yeah, they really, they loved building in stone. Egyptian architecture is probably the best in the ancient world. There's just no two ways about it. Writing. The Egyptians developed their own system of writing. They probably were inspired by the Mesopotamian system, but they take the same principles and they move it in a slightly different direction. So their system of writing is called hieroglyphs. It's quite a complex system. Again, like the Mesopotamian, it has about maybe 500-600 symbols. But because everything has to be drawn, it can't be written quickly. So by the end of the Bronze Age, the Egyptians are actually trying to simplify their system because the system is too complicated to be really very useful. Mathematics. Again, like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians are really, really good at geometry. Very advanced civilization, very able to do all sorts of cool stuff. Their geometry is, again, like the Mesopotamians, primarily involved with measuring land, because when the river rises and floods the land, it will wipe out all the markers for boundaries. So to remark the boundaries, they have to go and measure out the land. So hence geometry. So their geometry is excellent, but their arithmetic is terrible. So they have good enough geometry to build the pyramids, but bad enough arithmetic that they never actually figure out how to do multiplication. So yeah, it's quite interesting, really, that one. Like the Mesopotamians, they also develop relatively advanced astronomy. However, they're less concerned with predicting the future because their land is much more stable and they're able to kind of do I like to think of Egypt as playing a game on easy mode. Like it's pretty easy to kind of control the region. So stability, which I've taken a picture of a battle, but basically Egypt militarily is very easy to control if you control Egypt. Sorry, that's a bit of a silly statement, but my point is Egypt is quite difficult to attack. If you want to attack it from, say, Mesopotamia or from Israel, you have to go along the coast road by the Sinai Desert. So if the Egyptians can man the coast road, sort of control that, basically no army can get past. To the south, they have the Kingdom of Khush that they have to be worried about, but the Kushites can only attack up the river. So you go and you put a fort at the south to mine the south, fine, that's basically it. So if you man one place in the north and one place in the south, you can't really be attacked. During the Bronze Age, there aren't really large enemy fleets, and from the Western Desert, there aren't enough people in the Western Desert to seriously threaten Egypt. So if Egypt can remain united and man those 2 points, it's very difficult to attack. The long and the short of this is that Egypt is probably the most stable and the most secure place in the world at the time. It also means that they're not necessarily as good at fighting as other places are because they don't have to be. They only need to man 2 places and they're safe and secure. So it's kind of a political trick that the Egyptians kind of learn very early on. If their kingdom is united, they're almost invincible. So moving on a little bit to the lands between these two sort of river civilizations. The between lands, or the little kingdoms, as I sometimes think of them. So you can see here that there is, so the Euphrates River takes a bend around here. This is an artificial lake. It's caused by a dam. The dam is modern. But the river would originally have flown around, have gone around here, and its source is up here in these mountains. The green comes from the rain, which comes from the Mediterranean and basically falls along the coast here. These are the Lebanon mountains. Beyond this is the plains of Damascus, which are fertilized by the rain from the Lebanon mountains that goes down here. The River Jordan, it goes along here and terminates in the Dead Sea, which is the lowest lake on Earth. And then the green lands basically kind of peter out around here, going down to Sinai, and then you're just left with that narrow coast road all the way to Egypt. So looking at this map here, you can see how easy it was for Egypt to defend their lands. So let's have a look at some of the kingdoms in this region. So we have in the north, just off of the River Euphrates here. And by the way, whenever the Bible talks about the river, as in with a capital O, they're nearly always referring to the River Euphrates. It was the largest river in the region, and everyone kind of knew it. So if you wanted to say the river, that was what they meant. Quite often, the Bible will refer to this land as between Egypt and the river. So meaning this sort of region here. So in the north, you can see the Neo-Hittite states. Beneath that, the Kingdom of Hamath, which for a lot of, say at the time of King David, is an ally of David. Down here, you have the Kingdom of Damascus, which is sometimes known as Aram. Here along a narrow strip of coastland between the mountains and the sea is Phoenicia. Phoenicia has only a tiny amount of land, but they don't need much land because they are traders. They are able to sail across the sea in a way that other nations don't. Down here you have Israel, Ammon, Moab, Edom, and along the coastal plain you have Philistia, 5 cities along the coast. So that gives you an idea roughly of how, so this is the world as it kind of looked around 1050 BC. These sort of kingdoms last for much of the early Iron Age. So for a lot of the period that we're going to be talking about, these are kind of the major players, as it were. So the far north are the Neo-Hittite states. They're relatively powerful for these smaller kingdoms, but because they are further north, they don't really get mentioned in the Bible all that much. They're mentioned a few times, but not much. So I literally just put in this slide because I quite like this artwork, so I just thought it might be interesting to people. The Phoenicians are quite important to Israel. They are part of a trade network that connects a lot of the ancient world. They're really the best seafarers in the ancient world. This is an illustration of some of their ships. You can see the ships are very small. This is really, you would need quite a lot of courage to go out in the open sea in these ships. But the Phoenicians have quite a lot of courage and they're able to go and do this. The Israelites are not comfortable going onto the sea, and most of the other peoples in the region are not comfortable going onto the sea. So the Phoenicians kind of form a very vital role in international trade. And this is actually mentioned in the Bible. So here's a quote from Ezekiel. When your wares came from the seas, you satisfied many peoples. With your abundant wealth and merchandise, you enriched the kings of the earth. So moving south from Phoenicia, which is here, you can see the kingdom or the city of Sidon, city of Tyre. You can see the quite large kingdom of Damascus. And Damascus is really quite important. It would be probably the most powerful of the kingdoms between the river and Egypt. Apart from Damascus, the other sort of great power in the region is Israel, which is here. And after the split between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, Judah, which is down here, would have been kind of the other sort of small kingdom. And generally speaking, Israel, the northern kingdom, is more powerful than Judah, the southern kingdom. And to the west, or sorry, to the east of the Jordan River, which is here, you see the kingdom of Ammon and the kingdom of Moab. To the south here is the kingdom of Edom, which looks relatively large, but is not actually all that important because a lot of this land is basically desert. It's not all that fertile. Over here, along the very fertile, very flat plains, just off the Mediterranean, are the Philistine cities. They don't control much land, but because their land is so fertile, for a time, they're actually able to be disproportionately powerful, more so than their territory would suggest. So that is roughly the region that we're kind of looking at. So we have, in the course of this talk, we have kind of looked at sort of some ideas about history and what history is and what history isn't. And we've had a quick look at sort of some broad patterns to understand about the ancient world. We've had a look at the geography of the ancient world, both in the very broad perspective of the 2 great river valleys and the lands between them, and then a little bit more of a slightly in-depth look at the, a very brief in-depth look at the lands in between. So if there's kind of one thing, to take away from this entire picture, from this entire talk, it would be a picture of the importance of Israel as sort of a linchpin, as sort of a hinge of the ancient world. That the great population centers of the ancient world are in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and that Israel is on the corridor between those two. And as a result, it's extremely strategic. So if you look actually, not just even during the biblical period, but throughout history, people have been very, very interested in that stretch of land. And you look at it on a map and you go, it's a very small stretch of land. Why is it so important? I hope that this gives some idea of why this piece of land might be considered to be very important, and why, say, for example, I mean, not going to say this definite, but why, say, for example, God might choose this place to go and have his chosen people to go and be a light for the world. So, yeah, Israel is a pivotal point. So that is basically this particular evening's talk. Does anyone have any questions?